Hi, everyone, and welcome to Narratives, Embodiment, and the Stories We Tell. First thing I want to talk about is this idea that narratives are ubiquitous. They pervade every human culture. We organize our individual moments and our collective cultural moments into stories to share. And we share those interpersonally with one another. We share those as large myths and fables that we tell each other to communicate what our values are. And we also write stories for people to read, to understand different human experiences and different ways to move through the world through different bodies. And so, what we're going to do this semester is explore the stories that our bodies make as we move through culture. First, I want to talk about some three general ideas of how we approach stories. One is the mythic tales, the hero narratives, and sometimes they're based in truth and culture. Sometimes they're not. They're based in fantasy. And these range from religious narratives. We're not quite sure if these historical figures were exactly how some religious texts say we are. Sometimes it is a fantasy of this idea of larger than life beings, such as the Greek myths and heroes. And then we have, even in our own histories, these different figures who become legends. We aren't completely sure if George Washington cut down a cherry tree and then could not tell a lie, but we tell the story again and again. The musical Hamilton is based off a biography, but there's a lot of license taken to make him the hero that the playwright wanted him to be. And some of those traits become embedded into now our understandings of him and also those other characters in that show. We also have literary narratives, stories written for others to read. I'm right now going through the Harry Potter series with my sons and thinking how generations are introduced to Harry Potter. He's become a phenomenon of how we teach our children about good and evil. And then there's personal narratives, the stories we tell each other about ourselves and what it means to live through our bodies in the world. You have so many moments that you've lived, millions and millions of moments, but you stop and you take some and you section them off with beginning, middles, and ends to remember and tell other people. And that's how we create who we are with others through stories. So let's talk about what happens when we choose a story. And this is a concept we're going to think about throughout the semester because it's what makes a great story. First, think of the story as visceral. And the term visceral comes from of or pertaining to the viscera, which is our stomach area, that place where we feel the flutters of anticipation and nerves, the sinking of dread, the swell of pride are all in this area. And that's why we call those moments visceral moments. That we say something just happened. This gave me a feeling. And now I'm going to move through the world differently because this is a story I have about me that I'm going to tell other people. And the telling comes to the collaborative. I like the word collaborative because it means to work one with another. And storytelling is work. It's work for that storyteller crafting the tale, and it's work for the audience that is listening and processing that tale. And also remember, it's collaborative in that there are other characters in there that worked with you in life, worked with that storyteller to make the visceral meanings that compelled them to tell this story. So, this idea that there's nothing isolating about storytelling. Storytelling is work with others. And last, remember that stories are susceptible. how we make meaning of those visceral moments that we create a story with characters in it to tell others are always open to change. We'll understand that story in different ways as we have different life experiences. I have a close friend, and he told me a story of how when he was growing up, he never understood that he was poor. And when he looks back on his childhood and he looks at the meals his parents were making and what they did for fun as a family, he'll say, the reason we never went anywhere, the reason we had such a narrow, repetitive diet is because we were isolated and rural without a lot of access because we didn't have a lot of financial resources. But as a child, when he was crafting those stories, he didn't think of it that way because everyone else had the same amount of money that he did. And it wasn't until he went off to college that he was aware that his stories of childhood were also stories of poverty. And in that way, life changes. We understand things in new, different ways. So, what do stories do? Why are they important to study, to know, to tell, to analyze? Because they make meaning out of our life experiences and those visceral moments. They also become a vehicle to argue. I have friends who are lawyers, and I have students who have taken this course that are now lawyers, and they'll tell me that stories are a vehicle to argue their cases because they need to craft a story that that judge and that jury finds compelling so they can argue that case and be able to change people's feelings, make them believe that this is what happened. It's a way to connect. We share our experiences. Sometimes you think you hear a friend's story and you're like, oh my gosh, now how you behave, how you respond makes so much more sense now that I know that about you. Sometimes it's to entertain, right? And that's movies, that's plays. That's when we might just want to tell a story because it's funny and we all want to hear it again. Think of those family stories that we tell over and over because it's fun. Now, that also makes meaning and helps collective understanding, but part of it is just for fun. Now, we also craft stories to mislead, right? When you think of this idea, when someone wants an alibi, right? They have to make this whole story to the police to compel them to think, here's where I was, even though I wasn't there. So sometimes we tell a story to mislead people because we know that visceral emotional reaction of somebody collaborating with us in that storytelling process can be used to make them think something that perhaps isn't true. And also to mobilize others to action. Think of the story of George Floyd that we tell again and again, of Trayvon Martin, of Rosa Parks. Those stories mobilize us. They move us through the world, that we are going to make the world better because those stories have inspired us to change things. And what we do as we listen to narratives and we analyze our own stories is we map this process as it happens. So here's some other motivations that are more narrowed in as we look at narrative as a mode of inquiry or a way to study. Part of it is critiques of positivist modes for inquiry. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what that means in a bit. But it's basically that idea that there is a capital T truth that we can go out there and find that exists apart from us and that can be used to predict behavior. Also, it's fascinating to see how people love memoirs. They love autobiographies. They love stories of others. So we study them because we know people think they're important. And as we mentioned before, identity movements, right? The emancipation of people of color, the stories of women fighting for rights, right? The iron-jawed angels, stories of women's suffrage and getting the right to vote. The idea of LGBTQA of how those rights come, right? We hear story after story. Right after the Marriage Equality Act passed, we had many, many different couples in the news of how long they had been together, and now they're married. There is a new documentary out that maps the disability rights movement called Crip Camp and tells the stories of those children who met at a camp, resonated with one another, and grew up to change legislation, right? Their stories help us understand how big social change happened. And then there's the rise of therapeutic culture, right? How we're learning that it's okay to have a counselor help us with our mental health, to go and see someone that helps us make sense of that. And how do they make sense of that? They listen to our stories. So, through the stories we tell, we learn how individuals and groups become who they are. And this links back to phenomenology, the study of how humans with similar embodied experiences also have similar understandings and meanings. We access the experience of others and develop a deeper understanding of ourselves through listening to the stories their bodies have lived. And that's something you want to really think about as we move through this course. And it's called phenomenological perception from existential phenomenology. And what I want you to be believing about that and understanding about this particular lens is that bodies harbor knowledge about our culture. And that's from Joni Jones. We know things. We are experts of experiencing the world through our bodies. And because of that, when people listen and we share those stories, while they can never be us, they can access and empathize with an experience outside themselves. And sometimes, if they have a similar body, if they are a similar location in life that focuses on this story, then they can sometimes feel they're not alone. So there is this idea that personal narratives are embodied. They are a story of a body, right? A body living through the world, told through a body. Whether we're telling it or we're writing it, we are using our bodies to create the story, to communicate with other bodies. And as we look into that story, cultural conflict becomes concrete. And it comes concrete in that we know what a particular body's personal narratives are. And also, when we look at the myths and the literary stories, we find out how that particular culture is struggling and how they make sense of those struggles through the stories they create. Going back to the Harry Potter example, the struggle over good and evil and power versus relationships. All of that is there. And we as a culture resonate with Harry's struggles, and we go with him through it and learn about what it means to be human through that particular story. So this idea that we have personal stories that we listen and tell, and also those larger cultural stories that people choose to create for us to make sense of things. I'm going to do a little bit more in depth of existential phenomenology and embodied knowledge. Now, as I said before, each body is an intimate expert in what it means to live through their body in the world. Because how the world responds to your body, how it interprets your identity, your cultural location, your characteristics, is going to impact your experience. We know how other bodies respond to us. There are patterns we see. We are aware, and we gain knowledge about ourselves through how others respond to us. So we are able to map power dynamics of our body's social and cultural location in relation to other bodies. I'll give you an example of this. I have a friend who was very overweight for most of her life. She was categorized medically as obese, and she got surgery and she lost a lot of weight. And I asked her, "How are you feeling?" And she says, "Well, I feel really warm and friendly and happy, not because I'm healthier so much." She said, but because throughout my life, as a really large person, people used to drop their eyes when I walked in. People never wanted to chat with me in a coffee line. People looked upset when I got on the plane. She said, people were just really unfriendly. And I never thought about that being just my body. Well, maybe on the plane, she said, because I knew that I was going to maybe take up more than one seat and that was upsetting someone. But I just assumed overall people just aren't friendly, that if people don't know you and they're not your friends, they don't interact with you. And she said, suddenly people were commenting on my blazer and my shoes and my hair in the coffee line. People I didn't know, strangers, and I realized, wow, as an average sized person, the world is so much more friendly. People make eye contact and smile. For the first 25 years of my life, no one ever did that. Another example is when one of my friends was telling me as he transitioned in his life from being lower of socioeconomic status to having more money. He realized with the way he carried himself and his expensive clothing and his expensive car that people paused and listened more closely to him. He said he found it frustrating because he hadn't gotten smarter, but he had become more powerful and people cared more about what he had to say. So there is this idea that we learn about power dynamics, we learn about size, we learn about race, we learn about gender, we learn about sexuality, we learn about socioeconomic status, of cultural location. We learn about these things through the stories of bodies that have lived that experience. Another great example of this is if you think of how we've been hearing stories of Black people's interactions with police and learning that being Black means that interaction with their body and police is different than their white friends. And their white friends will say, yes, I saw this and I was so surprised. My niece dated a Black man and couldn't believe when they were pulled over for a routine infraction that they had to then get out of the car while it was searched. They were put on the ground in handcuffs and then ultimately let go because there was nothing wrong. And that helped my niece, who was white, and her white family realize, wow, driving while Black is different than driving while white. So these are kinds of things we can understand through the stories bodies live. And it offers that intimacy and that connection that while we can never truly be in someone else's body, we can access that dynamic and that connection. And it allows us to glimpse the utopian performative. And we'll talk about this throughout the semester, but the utopian performative is imagining a life that is better than these stories' experiences. What would a world look like that's more inclusive, more open than the world we're in now? And listening to those stories helps us imagine what that could be. And that is the end of part one. We will be back soon with understanding how to collect narrative data through an interview.